Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is Jordan and thank you so much for clicking on one of my bookish videos. Today I am starting my 2025 book wrap-ups by talking about my favorite fantasy and dystopian books of the year. I love wrap-up season. It's some of my favorite time to talk about all of the books I read and especially my favorites. It has been a really great year of reading for me, but especially in fantasy, I feel like I found a lot of fantasy standalones and sci-fi and dystopian that I really enjoyed, which normally I'm a very big series gal, so I am hoping to find a few more series to get lost in 2026. I planned my December TBR to have a lot of rereads and early copies for 2026, so I can say with a good amount of finality that these are my favorite fantasy and dystopian books of the year. So if you're interested in finding out about these books, then keep on watching. Okay, so I'm going to start off with a few of my young adult favorites. I typically have always been very heavy in the young adult fantasy genre, but I will say I feel like I leaned a lot more adult fantasy this year, probably just because as I age, I'm more interested in reading more of like epic fantasy type books, and those tend to be adult. There were quite a few young adult fantasy dystopian books I really enjoyed, and first off, we have Immortal Consequences by Ivy Marie. This is a debut dark academia fantasy book by this author. I absolutely loved it. I cannot wait for the sequel, which will be coming out next year. This is set in a academy that is in the afterlife, and so it follows six main characters, multiple point of views of six young people who have died and passed into the afterlife, and they are going to Blackwood Academy where they're studying to basically like be part of the elite academia who helps guide people from the afterlife to then move on. And they get themselves involved in these very intense trials and competitions within this secret society in the academy. There's a lot of very wonderful characters and relationships, both romantic and platonic, and I really loved the writing about grief and death and moving on and healing in this book, and it's one of my favorites. Next, we have a favorite for quite a lot of people, and that is Sunrise on the Reaping by Suzanne Collins. This is the newest book in the Hunger Games universe, and it specifically follows Haymitch, who was Katniss in the Hunger Games trilogy, her mentor in the Hunger Games, and he was part of the Hunger Games. He was a victor himself in the 50th annual Hunger Games, and so this is following a young Haymitch. It is a really heartbreaking story about what he went through and where he came from in District 12. It's very interesting how Suzanne Collins integrated a lot of the characters that we know and love from later in this world and showed how they were all connected together. And I thought that the themes of propaganda and fascism were very interesting and very timely. There were a lot of parallels to what is going on today in our political system, which I really loved. So I love this. I'm so excited for the movie next year. Okay, next I read another dystopian type book, and that was Fable For the End of the World by Ava Reed. I love Ava Reed so much. They're one of my favorite authors, and this is their first, I think, young adult dystopian type book, and I really loved it. I actually think that this may be my favorite Ava Reed book. I feel like it's so underrated. This book basically it's definitely inspired by a lot of the dystopian books that we grew up with, so The Hunger Games and Divergent, and in this book you're following two young girls. One is basically this warrior assassin soldier in the group that is running the government in this really like beaten down, poor, climate change ridden world. And the other girl has been chosen as basically like this victim in this type of competition where the warrior soldier chases down and hunts and kills the victim. It's very, very interesting. It's also a queer love story between the two girls, which I really, really loved. Absolutely so heartbreaking, but I loved Avery Reed's writing in this genre, and I'm super excited to see what else she does with new releases in this genre next year. Next, I read a new book and the second book in one of my favorite young adult fantasy romantasy duologies, and that is Rebel Witch by Kristen Cicerelli. This is the second book in the Crimson Moth duology. I read Heartless Hunter and then picked this one up at the beginning of the year and absolutely loved it. Gideon and Rune are two of my favorite like romantasy love interests and pairings, and I just feel that the world that Kristen builds in this duology is so impressive and fast-paced, especially the second book. So without giving away spoilers, this is set in a world where witches are being hunted. They were previously in control and did a lot of harm, and so now Gideon is one of the witch hunters. He is chosen to hunt down Rune, who's like one of the most powerful witches, and in this book the two of them are dealing with a lot of betrayal in their relationship, but also still feeling the connection and being drawn to each other. And it's just very angsty. There's a lot of tension. The action in the fantasy world building is really, really great, and I loved it. Okay, next we have another young adult dystopian book. That is Coldwire by Chloe Gong. I love Chloe Gong. She's one of my favorite authors, and I love her young adult books so, so much. And I was very curious to see how she would do a dystopian book because she typically does fantasy, romantasy-ish. And this was fantastic. It's a cyberpunk dystopian. It's set in this world that has been overcome with climate change and disease. And so basically they've created a system where people who can afford it, who are wealthy, live in this virtual reality world. And then the poor people live in the down country and they're forced to basically like fend for themselves. And you're following two female main characters who are kind of living parallel lives in the upcountry virtual reality world, working to defeat this anarchist on behalf of the very wealthy corporation that they're both working for. This book was crazy. The plot twists at the end and the parallels between the two girls and how their storylines come together was absolutely insane. I cannot wait for the second book and just to see where their series goes. And I really, really enjoyed Chloe's writing of virtual reality, AI, sentient AI, and the ramifications of putting all our time and effort into living in an AI curated world. And it was really well done. Next, we have one of my favorite books of the year and probably my favorite young adult book, and that is Oathbound by Tracy Deonne. This is the third book in the Legendborn cycle series, which is one of my favorite series of all times. This book was a really important book, I think, in terms of world building and moving the plot along, but also getting a lot of character development. It felt quite different from the other two books in the series because it definitely slowed down in terms of the pacing, but I absolutely loved it. Without giving spoilers away for this third book, basically the Legendborn cycle series is about this girl who is going to UNC as like an early college student, and she discovers the secret society that's based around King Arthur and his knights, discovers that she actually has inherited some sort of power in King Arthur's society as well as ancestral magic from her mother and other Black ancestors, and she becomes a very important member of the society against everybody else's wishes, and is also in the middle of this really big war between a lot of the different magical beings in societies. I love it. This book was fantastic. It has multiple point of views for the first time, and I really liked seeing other characters. The love triangle in this between Bree, Nick, and Sel went to the next level. All right, now we're going to move on to adult fantasy, sci-fi, and dystopian. And first up, I have a romantasy that was one of my favorite romantasies of the year, and that is Our Vicious Oaths by N.E. Davenport. This is a standalone fantasy romantasy book, and And again, for some reason, it was really the year of standalone fantasy books for me. And this is definitely a very, very big standout. I love this book. It is super spicy and super heavy on the romance, but for a standalone book, it really built up a very intricate world, incorporated a lot of politics and political intrigue, which I really, really loved. It follows Kadisha and Malachi. Kadisha is this princess who basically is being married off to one of like the high kings, and Malachi is a high king himself in his dominion. Malachi basically plots to kill Kadisha's family and her betrothed, and succeeds in doing so, and basically starts a war between Kadisha's betrothed and his kingdom. Kadisha and Malachi have a really, really strong connection from the moment they meet. They develop quite a wild relationship and have to start trusting each other to accomplish their goals and protect their loved ones. It was so much fun. It honestly was a very, very memorable fantasy read, and I loved it. Next, we have a favorite romantasy series of the year for me, and that is the Kindred Curses Spark of the Everflame saga. So this is the first book in the series, and honestly, I did not know if I was going to like this. I've heard a lot of very mixed reviews from a lot of friends, but I read this at a time where I just was in a really big slump in terms of romantasy. I felt like I just was seeing the same books and tropes and stories again and again. And honestly, nothing about this is very unique, but for some reason, it was the one series this summer and fall that really caught my attention, and I absolutely flew through it. I loved it so, so much. It follows Diem, who basically is immortal, living in this world controlled by the gods, and their offspring figures out throughout this first book that she actually does have magical powers, and kind of finds herself in a really bad position in terms of working with one of the princes, Prince Luther, feeling a connection to him, and also trying to work out the secret of what happened to her mother, who has disappeared. This series, as it goes along, definitely gets more intense on terms of the politics, which I really enjoyed. It's nothing super groundbreaking, but I do really enjoy the politics between the different kingdoms, and the slow burn romance is the standout for me in the series. I love it, and I cannot wait for the fourth book. Okay, next we have a fantasy book, romantasy, that I really enjoyed, and that is A Forbidden Alchemy by Stacey McEwen. This book is inspired by Peaky Blinders, which I love because Peaky Blinders is one of the TV shows that I really, really enjoyed. This follows Nina and Patrick, so it's set in like a magical world where they all have alchemy based like powers. In this book, Nina and Patrick meet when they're very, very young while they're going through school trying to be chosen as alchemists. They meet again years later. Nina is on a mission to basically prove herself to the people in power in her group in order to protect her family, and she goes on a mission where she has to infiltrate Patrick's town, where he's basically like this ringleader of their town and their mob, and the two of them kind of rekindle their feelings for each other. There is a lot of betrayal and a lot of plot twists in this book. I believe it's going to be a full series, so this is only book one, and I cannot wait to see where the rest of the series goes. Next, we have one of my favorite romantasy series of the year, and that is the Jasad Heir and the Jasad Crown, which is the Scorched Throne duology. This duology packs a punch. It is an Egyptian-inspired fantasy, epic fantasy, romantasy series, and I absolutely loved it. It features Sylvia and Aaron. So Sylvia is the Jasad heir. She comes from a kingdom that had magic, and basically their kingdom was burned down when the other kingdoms turned against them for fear of their power and what they could do with their magic. And Aaron is the Nizal heir who hates Jasad. And in this first book, the two of them meet each other and basically are forced to work together. Aaron kind of blackmails Sylvia Sylvia into being his champion and fighting for Nizal in a competition. And the two develop very big feelings for each other, even though Sylvia knows that they could never be together because of how much their kingdoms hate each other. With this series, there is a lot of betrayal. It is definitely a very, very slow burn, which I love. And I really like the themes of injustice, colonialism, and oppression throughout this duology. The next book I read was another epic fantasy with a bit of a romantasy, and that is The Raven Scholar by Antonia Hodgson. This is book 1 in the Eternal Path trilogy, and so far there's only one book out. It's quite a big one, and it just was such an interesting and fascinating epic fantasy to read. So basically, it's set in this world where the magic system comes from these 8 different animal gods. They live in a world where this empire has an emperor that every 25 years a new emperor is chosen. And in this book, Nima, who is the emperor's high scholar, is chosen to uncover a murder mystery. One of the other champions in this competition is murdered, and so Nima is chosen to figure out what happened, who killed her, and in the course of doing so uncovers a lot of secrets about the empire and who the emperor really is and the people that are within the emperor's close circle. This book is really heavy in terms of a bit of a mystery, which I really enjoyed in a fantasy world, and I really like the aspects of the different animal gods and the way that they choose their champions and pass down their powers, and I'm very, very excited for the next book in this series. Next, I read one of my favorite books of the year, which I would call loosely a fantasy type book, but I do want to give it a mention, and that is I, MEDUSA by Ayana Gray. This is a Greek mythology retelling, and it is Medusa's story reimagined. So Ayana takes Medusa, who was always this very villainized female figure in Greek mythology and culture, and goes through her whole life from a young girl with her sisters on her island to meeting Athena and meeting Poseidon, becoming one of Athena's acolytes, falling for Poseidon and being trapped and fooled by him, and then the aftermath after she was turned into a monster and got the power to turn people to stone. It was one of the most well-written, beautifully heartbreaking stories. It dealt a lot with the story that Medusa was sexually assaulted by Poseidon, so definitely check trigger warnings with this one because it's very heavy. But I think the way that Ayana Gray took the character of Medusa and twisted it and gave her a new light to be shown in was fantastic. I cried. I loved it. It was so great. Next, we have one of my favorite series of the year that I miss literally every day, and that is the Stormlight Archive series. And specifically, I have Wind and Truth. I read the final 2 books in the first arc of this series this year, Rhythm of War and Wind and Truth. And despite hearing some mixed opinions about this final book in arc 1, I really, really enjoyed it. This is one of my favorite epic fantasy series ever. It is an absolute beast to get through, and right now there's only the first 5 books out in what's going to be a 10-book series. But the way that Brandon Sanderson built up this world in the Cosmere and fleshed out all of these characters so intensely with all of their arcs is just, nobody else has ever done it that way, in my opinion. And I had so much fun reading this book. It definitely comes to a climax because it is the end of arc 1, and so a lot of things happen in this book, but I really, really enjoyed it. It's set over the course of 10 days, which I think is a very interesting way to pace a very, very long book, and I absolutely loved it. I finished reading this, I think, in May or June, and I literally think about this series and miss reading it every single day. Okay, next we have what I think is my favorite book of the year, although I still have to evaluate everything for my top books, but that is Bury Our Bones in the Midnight Soil by V.E. Schwab. If you know me, you know that I've been talking about this book all year. I've read it 3 times and loved it more every single time. I love V.E. Schwab as a writer, but this toxic lesbian vampire book is just so much fun and was so beautifully written. It reminds me a lot of the very lyric lyrical prose and writing that she has in The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue, combined with a lot of her typical morally gray characters that she has in her other like fantasy sci-fi series. This follows 3 females. They are all turned into vampires against our will, and it's set in 3 different time periods. And throughout the book, these 3 females come together, falling in love with each other, fighting with each other, killing with each other. And it just is such an interesting story of love, lust, hunger, obsession, grief, and loss. And I loved it so, so much. Next, we have another favorite in a romantasy series, and that is The Night and the Moth by Rachel Gillig. This is the same author as the One Dark Widow series, and I enjoyed that series, but this is my favorite series of her so far. This is like a dark gothic fantasy knights and monsters type book, and it is just so much fun. It follows Sybil, who is a seer. She's a diviner. She can basically use her powers to predict people's futures, and her other diviner sisters go missing, and so she goes on a adventure, a journey to try to figure out what happened to them with this knight named Rory and her gargoyle Bartholomew, who is the best part of the book. And the 3 of them form this really wonderful connection, a bit of a romance between Sybil and Rory. And the ending, again, a lot of betrayal, a lot of plot twists. I'm super, super excited for the next book that comes out next year. I think you should definitely read it. Next, we have another top favorite of the year for me, and that is Chain Gang All-Stars, which is, I would say, like an adult dystopian speculative fiction book. This book I think should be a must-read for all adults. It's genuinely one of the most well-written, interesting, horrifying type books I've ever read. It is set in a dystopian world that doesn't seem very far from our future now, where it's analyzing the mass incarceration and criminal justice system. Prisoners in this world are sent to a really horrible prison mass incarceration system where, because of the conditions in those prisons and jails and within the system, they can choose to be part of Chain Gang All-Stars, which is this like pro sports program where prisoners join a team, they form a chain between a few different prisoners, and they fight to the death in these arenas and competitions where people, unincarcerated people, bid and bet and watch and cheer on these death matches. So it gives kind of similar vibes to the Hunger Games, but this feels a lot more realistic. And what I really, really like is it incorporates quotes and literature on the mass incarceration system in the United States within the book, which I think is very, very important. So you know exactly what they're talking about. I highly recommend this book. It's very informative. It's also horrifying, and it is one of the best books I've ever read. Okay, last but not least, another favorite of mine this year is KATABASIS by R.F. Kong. This book I loved. I know that people had a lot of mixed opinions about it, but personally, as someone who loves R.F. Kong and her books so much, she really has never disappointed me, but I really connected with Alice's character in this one, and I think it made me really, really appreciate the book and the journey that Alice went on. So KATABASIS stands for like a hero's journey into hell. And so in this book, R.F. Kong takes a lot of different depictions of the underworld and hell from different literatures and mythology, and sends Alice, who is a PhD student, into the underworld, into hell, to find her missing dead professor. There's a little bit of a romance, which I did really enjoy, but mostly I think that the descent into hell for Alice was a metaphor of types for her working through her mental health and her depression and suicidal thoughts as related to her academic journey. I really, really enjoyed it for that reason. That's what I took away from it, and I think that Alice's journey was very healing for her and for myself, and I really, really enjoyed it. It felt different for Kong, but same old characters and academic fantasy type setting. Okay, so that is it for me. Those are all of my favorite fantasy, a little bit of sci-fi, dystopian books of the year. Very heavy fantasy year for me, as always. I really am looking for some more epic fantasy, really immersive series to get myself into in the new year. Because I will say, I feel like I didn't find as many series that I was absolutely obsessed with this year, but I found some really, really great standalones and duologies, which is always super fun. Hopefully you guys enjoyed hearing about some of these books and you can add some to your TBR for the new year. And I can't wait to hear from you what your favorite fantasy book of the year is. I would love to hear if you've figured that out already. If you are interested in seeing more bookish videos from me, I would love it if you subscribe and stick around, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye.